This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that is tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you. This episode is part of a series produced in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, where we examine democracy, populism, and authoritarian trends in the region and around the world.
And we are grateful for their partnership. We are pleased to welcome today Yochai Benkler. He is the Berkman Professor of Entrepreneurial Legal Studies at Harvard Law School and the faculty co-director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. His books include The Wealth of Networks, How Social Production Transforms Markets and Freedom from 2006, which won so many awards that we don't have time to list them all. He is also a socially engaged academic who has advised governments and international organizations on innovation, policy, and telecommunications. We will be talking today about his latest co-authored book, Network Propaganda, Manipulation, Disinformation, and Radicalization in American Politics, co-authored with Robert Faris and Hal Roberts, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Yochai Benkler, thank you for joining us on the show.
Very happy to get a chance to talk to you.
We are too, especially because we're going to have to start with something we rarely do, which is relate to current affairs. We're not a headline news program. But as we're recording this, I assume by the time this is published, we will have clarity. But as we're recording this, the U.S. is going through the most significant clash of realities ever in my lifetime, a clash that is cutting open the constitutional basis of the leadership of the republic. Where do the two realities that are in such great conflict, I think we have to say, come from?
So we really do live in two completely different realities in the United States. And while the conversation generally focuses on social media and the internet, what my research has really shown with my team, what our research has really shown is that it's a much more fundamental and broader phenomenon. And really, we need to think of it in terms going back to the 70s and the 80s.
Not to 2006 when social media began?
Not to 2006 when social media began at all. You have to, there's a lovely Pew survey in 1996 asking where people get their news for presidential news. And about the same proportion of people who today get their news from Fox News and talk radio in 96 said they were getting their news from Christian television and talk radio. So the divergence really happens in the 80s when a new political identity emerges around the Republican Party, combining the white identity voters in the South and the Midwest backlash against the civil rights movement and the Christian fundamentalist backlash against the women's movement. And these really create a new market segment that for the first time makes right-wing outrage stoking into big business. It starts with televangelism moving to news in the 80s. It ramps up with talk radio on AM radio with Rush Limbaugh in the late 80s and early 90s. And it crystallizes in Fox News in 96. By the time you see internet sites that are really commercially focused on making money by joining this industry, the right-wing media ecosystem has already existed for 20 years. There's essentially no room in the market to be a conservative centrist outlet because the audiences have been used for 20 years to getting exactly what they want: outrage, anger at the other, distrust of media, distrust of science, distrust of government. And so the roots are very much there. And by the late 2000s, by the end of the first decade of the 21st century, we already see a highly asymmetric structure of the media ecosystem. We see a right wing anchored in Fox News, in talk radio, surrounded by online sites that are a propaganda feedback loop. They only focus on stories that confirm the political identity and discipline each other when they step out of line politically. By contrast, in the rest of the media ecosystem, and I won't talk about the left yet, on the rest of the media ecosystem, whether it's historically left publications like Mother Jones, whether it's new online left-oriented mobilization like Daily Kos, everyone is still anchored around professional media. And you have this continuous tension between trying to confirm identity and trying to be anchored in fact. So you have a deep divergence between a large but minority right-wing insular media ecosystem, and everybody from the Wall Street Journal and Forbes in the center right to Daily Kos and Mother Jones on the left, occupying a single large media ecosystem centered around mainstream professional journalistic organizations.
So why did it take for this phenomenon so long to kick in, as it were, and trickle up to politics and manifest itself in the way that it has done over the last few years, if it goes back decades?
So it occurs progressively over time as the size of the audience increases and the footprint increases. So in the 80s, because it's still very much in Christian television, it's still relatively narrow within the coalition, but it creates the business model. When it moves to radio, by 1994, when the Republicans take the House of Representatives, Limbaugh is already given all the credit. He's made an honorary member of the class of 94. He's already given a lot of credit. And remember, that's when Newt Gingrich becomes Speaker of the House. That's when the norms of comity in the House get completely exploded, and the structure of the extent to which House representatives stay with each other and have dinner together as opposed to go home and mobilize their base. So you're beginning to see that change in the institutional structure as well, responding to the media ecosystem. And then Fox News obviously becomes the central transition because of the size of the audience. And that takes a good 8 years. By 2000, there are early measures. They don't roll out everywhere at the same time. By 2000, 2004, you're already seeing expansion. And by 2008, you already have the Tea Party.
I have to say, I'm dating myself here, but I mean, I think that some of us forget that when those processes happened that you talked about after 1994, the breakdown of comedy in Congress, I think that's a good way of putting it, it was shocking at the time. We thought it was like unprecedented. And now it seems like nothing. We look back to those days because everything seems so much worse now. But I want to go back to the description of the media landscape. And I think that I have to start this, in a way, delving into this conversation by asking about your methodology for how you check your own bias. I mean, I'm going to represent, for the sake of this argument, I'm going to play the role of the right-winger in our conversation. And how do you approach this task of looking at this question scientifically of the role of media in the political developments? And how do you come to the characterization that the left-wing media outlets are professional and journalists and meet journalistic ethics, while the right-wing side of it is an echo chamber of propaganda?
Yeah, so the irony of our work is that most of the data, all of the data really, well, most, we do some TV. Most of the data we use is purely online on a very large scale. And when we then say it's not the online that's been driving it as much, but rather television and radio, we back it out of that. So just a quick whirlwind answer to what we did in network propaganda. We've been running for the last dozen years or so a system we built called Media Cloud that collects about 1 million stories a day that were published online. For this study, we analyzed 4 million stories that mentioned any presidential candidate or national politics from April of 2015 until January of 2018. For these 4 million stories, we analyzed how they linked to each other, which is essentially an image of the supply side. If I link to the New York Times, I'm treating the New York Times as authority. If I link to Breitbart, I'm treating Breitbart as authority, and so forth. And on the consumption side, we looked at Twitter and at Facebook posts in terms of which sites. So, for example, for our Twitter networks, we'll say we're going to look at which 2 sites were tweeted by the same person on the same day, and we'll say there's a link there. So if a lot of people tweet Fox News and the Daily Caller on the same day, we say Fox News and the Daily Caller are related to each other on the supply side. If people tweet out Daily Kos or Mother Jones and the New York Times on the same day, we say that's a tie between the two. And we aggregate over the course of the 4 years how often these sites have been tweeted together, and similarly how often they've been shared on public Facebook pages. So we have a good measure of what the media producers are doing in terms of how they link to each other as sources of authority or inspiration. And on the supply side, how people on Twitter and people on Facebook share different sites together. So that's what allows us to create network mapping. And we use network analysis to say, here are the sites that are most widely linked. They provide the most authority to producers. Here are the sites that are most widely tweeted, based on the right, based on the left. Here are the sites that are most Facebook shared. We also characterize the audience of the news sites by calculating for a large panel of Twitter users whether they are more conservative or less conservative. For the book itself, we used something much simpler that was good enough, which was, did they retweet Trump or Clinton? For the present work we've done on the 2020 election, we had a more sophisticated panel production system. But essentially what we do is we look at what people on Twitter do, and by that we calculate an ideology score from conservative to liberal for the Twitter user. And then we look for each site, what is the ratio of conservatives and liberals that shared the information. So that tells us, is a site a right-wing site, a center-right site, a center-left, or left site.
But I'm just going to stop you for a second. How do you characterize whether the site is up to professional journalism standards, as you characterized, the New York Times, et cetera, versus those that you have identified as more propaganda?
So on that one, there's a certain point at which you step back and you say to somebody who says, look, the Gateway Pundit or True Pundit is no different from the New York Times, I can't prove it to you. There we either are willing or not willing to anchor our reality in something. We're working now on new coding at the URL level, but practically all of the efforts that all of the groups that have tried to identify sites, whether it's NewsGuard, whether it's several of the groups that have had scientific publications, try to make assertions at the site level that say this is a site that does or doesn't follow journalistic practices. It has clear separation between editorial and opinion. It has high or low degrees of negative fact checking. But at the end of the day, there's no crisp, formal way that is widely recognized and used to say Hannity on Fox is opinion and full of lies, whereas the front page of the New York Times is fact-checked and not. If your fundamental trust, which is, by the way, the case for American conservatives, that you trust Hannity and Limbaugh and you distrust National Public Radio or the New York Times, there is no empirical technique that I can use to persuade you otherwise.
So what can be done? What really, I mean, of course, your analysis is really interesting, but I would like to take it maybe in a prescriptive direction. Is there any way, based on your very deep analysis, to have some sort of structural answer to the collapse of journalistic ethics and norms? Can it be maintained and guaranteed in any way other than the good faith of the practitioners and the readership?
The short answer is no. The only positive answer is that it is a large and powerful minority that exists inside this media ecosystem. And so the real question is what happens with mainstream journalists. So let me just take these things one at a time. First of all, it's critical to understand that what's happening in the right-wing media ecosystem in the United States is not an aesthetic choice. People prefer to be this way in media, and therefore, what's happened is a very powerful market dynamic where once we got massive expansion of channels with satellite, with cable, with FM radio making AM radio no longer viable except for talk, and then eventually with the internet, is that the standard mid-20th century strategy of trying to program for the middle and divide between 2 or 3 channels, one newspaper towns, you always programmed for the middle, and that's when professional journalism really takes off and comes into its own. Once you have the multiple channel environment, if somebody can come up with a strategy that slices off a meaningful segment of the market, that's dominant as a strategy relative to programming for the middle. And that's what's happened. So today, you have a large audience, not clear how large, could be as many as 40 million Americans, about half of the Republican Party voters, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, are inside a market where if somebody tries to offer an alternative product, they get shut down by their competitors. If a politician tries to have a more moderate message, they get shut down because it's almost like a high salt, sugar, fat diet that's just so attractive to the audience. It's so easy. It's so ready to provide emotional kick. So you've got a market structure that is now feeding this political structure, which you don't have outside. So as long as that's the case, there's no structural answer that says you should start eating your vegetables to an audience that's that size in such a diverse and open media environment. That doesn't mean there's nothing to do. But go ahead.
No, I think that's a very interesting metaphor. I'm always all for metaphors with relation to food, especially when it comes to the American food industry. And also the campaign strategy world, which is where I come from. We always used to talk about journalists wanting red meat, in the messages that a political campaign gives out. And you're saying the media environment is the same way. So that's just a comment. But I do want to ask you something about the substance of the research, because I think one of the most interesting things, and again goes back to the earlier statement you made about the asymmetry of the right and the left-wing media environment. One of the findings that you had was that they are asymmetrical in terms of how the audiences are concentrated. And I'd be curious for you to explain that to us. What was the asymmetry you found in the concentration of right-wing audiences around certain websites or media sources versus the center and left?
Yeah, so this isn't only our work. There's sustained survey work from multiple locations that shows that the Democratic voters and other non-Republican identifying Americans who are more politically uncommitted have a more diverse media diet. There's nothing like the concentration on Fox News. There's a more diverse media diet, and that comes from several things. First of all, the Democratic coalition is made up of quite distinctive and significant market segments. So you have media that are oriented toward Black audiences on radio, on television, online. Similarly, Spanish language for the Hispanic community. Before that, you've got NPR and public radio already providing something that's much more like the Wall Street Journal in the sense that it's straight news in the news side and then opinion orientation that serves some Democratic constituencies. And the same is true to a lesser extent with the New York Times and to a greater extent more recently with the Washington Post. So you just have the industry on the audience outside of the right, and I won't quite call it the left because it really has the left and the centrist, is broken up into smaller market segments, which is what happened when MSNBC in 2006 tried to shift strategies. They found that there's not enough of a market segment. There's enough to exist and do well economically, but not enough to really replicate the same kind of singularity of Fox, which also means that their audience is constantly also paying attention to other outlets, and so it's much harder to just do propaganda. You get criticized if you just do propaganda by other outlets your audience is watching. So that's why there's a bit of a reality check dynamic going on the left that doesn't exist on the right.
I'd like to take it back to social media and the internet. And as you said in the beginning, and you also expand on in the book, it cannot be down to the advent of social media alone because it's such a universal phenomenon. And if it were so, it would have affected everywhere around the world in the same or similar ways. And what you say now, even with more impetus, is that it's almost an idiosyncratically American phenomenon. And if we look at other cases in the world, the rise of populism, whether it's in the United Kingdom or in Brazil or in Israel even, can you draw parallels between what's going on in the United States and what's going on in other democracies?
So there's no question that we're seeing significant emergence of ethno-nationalist, more authoritarian-tending right-wing parties across democratic market societies, in which I include India, which is undergoing its own version and is certainly a large democracy and a market society. We saw it in Turkey as well. I think to put all of that on the shoulders of changes in media is to ask media to carry too heavy of a load. I think the driving force is more likely the internal collapse of neoliberalism. If you think of neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus, as it used to be called, as a program for shrinking the state and shrinking solidarity and promising economic dynamism and growth and entrepreneurship in exchange for state-backed economic security and mitigation of economic shock and individual self-fulfillment over collective identity. These worked for a while, from 30 years, until we hit the Great Recession and the consequences for masses of people who suddenly are faced with economic insecurity on one hand and a government ideology that says it's their fault because they failed to self-actualize, they fall back on people who tell them, no, it's that other guy's fault. That black guy, that brown guy, that Muslim guy, that whoever it is who's that guy, it's their fault. And that creates a tremendous base of attraction for these ethnocentric politics. How these interact with media changes from country to country. So certainly our study in the US suggests that Fox News and talk radio were absolutely central, and we suffered a perfect storm. You need to look at every country. In Germany, because the public television stations still have enormously high trust, what you see is that the AfD has its own relatively small and constrained media outlets, but there's nothing like the number of people, the proportion of the population that gets exposed to that propaganda, so it remains relatively contained. Similarly, in France, when colleagues did a similar analysis to ours on France, what you see is that much more of a divergence between anti-establishment and establishment on the left and the right, but still a very heavy focus on the traditional journalistic organizations. So there's a broad global reaction to the failure of neoliberalism that includes a very powerful emergence of solidaristic, ethno-nationalist hatred politics to form coalitions of disappointed working class people. And then it interacts with different media ecosystems to produce different results. It's entirely possible that in India and Brazil, you really do need to understand WhatsApp. But it might not be, because nobody really has done a serious study of Republic TV, which is India's equivalent of Fox News, or of the vernacular regional news outlets, which have similar phenomena. So until somebody's actually able to do, we're stuck with what we know how to measure, which is WhatsApp. But when the US, when we can measure more deeply, what we find is that it gives you a false sense of certainty when you only study Twitter that you found the answer. And once you start, as we did, to look across media, including mass media, you find that social media is much more peripheral.
It's very interesting. I mean, I think that the main defense that the social media executives have been trying to take or trying to project against the accusations that they have been solely or exclusively or prominently responsible is that, they say we are just a platform. And that makes me wonder if they really are just a platform. I mean, of course, we know the difference between them and media outlets. They don't have gatekeepers. But should we be thinking of them as the 21st century equivalent of the printing press, which was a platform for anybody to write anything, mass distributed? If we look back to the literature of the 15th and 16th century, will we see that they have similar fears and criticisms that this new technology is being blamed for the corruption of society?
Ask the printers who were burned by the Catholic Church whether
it was a leading
whether
question.
whether they thought it was an issue. Look,
so Jack Dorsey should be happy that he's just taking a little bit of heat.
Look, there's no abstract answer to the question of how we should treat platforms. There are only concrete questions of what to do about them and what not to do about them, as a matter of creating legal responsibility, as a matter of creating legal accountability. I worry about efforts to change the regulatory environment to put more editorial responsibility on the shoulders of a tiny number of monopolistic or at least oligopolistic companies that have their bottom line as their primary consideration. Do you want to trust Mark Zuckerberg, who, when confronted with the fact that his platform in 2016 offered a vector of disinformation for both Trumpists and Russians, to then change the algorithm, but find out that because of the asymmetry of the actual output on the right, he is differentially burdening the right. And in order to gain political points, he then forces his engineers to tweak the algorithm until Mother Jones also gets a hit, even though Mother Jones is left-wing but editorially sound. So I don't know that I'm willing to do that. How comfortable am I with Jack Dorsey deciding to shut down statements by the President of the United States? These are not democratic companies, and they're not companies that have the interest of the republic at heart. These are companies that have a particular focus on their own shareholders, often the founders. And I would be very wary of designing a system that puts too much weight on them.
But in any way, you're saying that it's not that critical because, unlike what many people think, what comes out of your book and your study is that there's really no need for this kind of silver bullet strategy to control and regulate social media because their effect is, at the end of the day, rather limited or more limited than we think.
In the United States, about national politics, I think it's really important, though, to emphasize those limitations. First of all, the core lesson of our studies is that you need to study on a country-by-country, market-by-market basis, because in some places they might be dominant and in other places they might not. Second, we are saying what we're saying when we're focused on large-scale national politics. When we did specific case studies in other journal articles about particular political campaigns, online was very important to shape a public mobilization around an issue. You can't look at the success of Black Lives Matter in forcing the public agenda to change without saying organization online matters. And the same is true for the domestic terrorists in the US that come under the name of militias, for super extremists who are very dangerous. So I don't want to minimize the importance of social media for marginalized communities to organize themselves. And some of them we might think are wonderful, and others of them we might think are horrible. And when we do the regulation, we need to make sure that we're not imagining, let's say you have my political views, we're not imagining that we're shutting down the militias, and then it turns out we're shutting down Black Lives Matter. Or if you have somebody opposed to my views, it's the other way around. So there's real value to social media in enabling communities outside the core to build mobilization, to shape the agenda. But that gets drowned out when you go into these major electoral politics where mainstream media takes over and becomes the lead anchor.
I mean, it sounds to me.
Go ahead.
It sounds to me like you're saying that the social media plays a very powerful role when it comes to mobilizing, and especially bringing in all sorts of communities to the mobilization, but maybe isn't responsible for the deep ideological polarization and sometimes even empirical polarization about facts that exist.
But in any event, the effect can be even minimal. Social media could have affected 80,000 voters in 3 states in 2016. And if they didn't go to the polls and voted for Donald Trump, but rather others voted for Hillary Clinton, we'd be having a very different discussion here today, don't you think?
Yes. So that's the one area where I do think it's really critically important to get the data, and nobody has it yet, is exactly that question. Down to the individual level, can you talk about outcomes of high-stakes elections in terms of exposures? For that, we need a different kind of regulation of the platforms. We need very strict requirements to deposit data in a data set that will be available under very strict conditions to independent researchers to be able to answer precisely that question, whether it was Russians who flipped the votes in one way or another in 2016, whether it's particular advertisements, were these advertisements about get out the vote or suppress the vote? It's very tricky because the company's business model is to collect so much information about every individual that doing the research probably exposes massive amounts of private information about individuals. So it's ethically very problematic, which is why you need to take it outside of the companies in a publicly governed forum, but under very strict conditions that prevent the academics from doing things like Cambridge Analytica did and taking the data out to manipulate people. So I'm not saying it's an easy thing, but we do need a publicly enforced disclosure and by the companies and publicly enforced non-disclosure by the academics to be able to study precisely that question, how advertising worked at the individual level to shape voting patterns, how propaganda interventions from foreign actors did or didn't impact at the individual level. These are very hard questions. They can't be done in a position of complete political polarization and contestation. But there really is the data there, and we really do need to do it. We just can't rely on the existing system where self-interested companies that fundamentally don't want to know the answer control the data. Facebook doesn't want to know that it is the reason Donald Trump is president because it'll alienate its Democrats. It doesn't want to know that it didn't contribute to Trump because it'll alienate its advertisers.
Sure.
So it's got a real conflict of interest in actually trying to figure out what happened.
I want to ask a very, very technical question, and that will be our penultimate question, and then we'll ask you our last question, in which we'll ask you to make sense of everything. But the technical question I have goes back to something that you mentioned earlier about whether we want the executives of Facebook and Twitter to be censoring stuff. And I do want to clarify. I hear President Trump, when by the time this is published, we don't know if he will still be President Trump, but he will still be president because the transition will not have happened yet. He has complained about censorship from social media. And on a technical level, have Twitter and Facebook, to the best of your knowledge, actually ever deleted one of his posts, or do they simply mark it as something of questionable factual basis?
No statement that comes out of the fingers or mouth of Donald Trump should be taken as truth. So the fact that he says it doesn't mean anything. No, they haven't deleted tweets. They've marked them with statements.
Then it's not exactly censorship, is it?
It depends on who is speaking, right? I can imagine a situation where a sufficiently marginalized voice that takes a particularly unpopular position and then gets slapped with falsehood notices, where it's not strictly censorship, but you'd have a real problem. Let's imagine, for example, that these were Facebook employees posting about abuses in work conditions. You'd have a problem with it, even if it didn't completely shut it down, but it just downgraded it or slapped on. It's the fact that you're talking about the man with the biggest megaphone in the world complaining that megaphone slightly distorts his voice. That's laughable.
Okay. Now we have to wrap up, unfortunately, because we'd like to keep talking about this for, I would say, between me and Gilad, maybe 3 hours. Yeah. Gilad is more large than me. In the early days of the internet and social media, there was a lot of talk about a much more optimistic understanding of what they would contribute to society, and they were seen as platforms that could help democratize knowledge because there was so much access for so many people all around the world. Now it seems like we live in these very dark times where all we see are nefarious forces coming out of social media and the internet at large. Do you think there's any capacity left for a positive contribution to democratization via the media, social media, and the internet?
The penultimate chapter in network propaganda is called "Can the Internet Survive Democracy?" By which I mean to say exactly that question. How do we reconcile the hyper-optimism of the first decade of the 21st century with the complete pessimism? And I think both are exaggerated. I think that we've come to know over the past decade particular known failure modes of decentralized action online. We know, for example, that from the experience of the Arab Spring, from the experience of Occupy, that leaderless distributed communications are weak. They get lost after the initial mobilization loses. On the other hand, we also know from the Black Lives Matter movement, from the Me Too movement, that the net continues, even at the height of this moment of pessimism, continues to be the platform for some of the most important and transformative social justice mobilization efforts that we've seen in the last decade. So we can't ignore that. The second thing that we see is that organized centers of power have learned how to use distributed media to leverage their own power. We saw it initially. I remember when Nagla Rizk from American University Cairo came and started to say how the Muslim Brotherhood on one hand and the military on the other had taken over Facebook and completely transformed the Egyptian public sphere as early as 2011, 2012. We saw it when the Obama campaign team in 2008 was all about distributed by Barack Obama, and in 2012 was all about extracting information and getting money from voters. We saw it with the Trump campaign and the Russians and their campaigns over 2016. So we need to construct systems, going back to what I said before, we need to construct systems based in civil society, supported by public funds, to identify these instances of public capture. The point is whether and to what extent the internet is a liberating and democratizing force or a confounding and authoritarian force is not technologically determined. It depends on the institutional framework within which the net is governed and on the social mobilization practices around how we use it. And so we need to develop these institutions that will allow us to counter the authoritarian and destructive uses of the net and support and enhance the democratizing effects. But there are people who are actively trying to emphasize the authoritarian and extractive aspects. So it's a continuous struggle. I don't know who will win. I just know that we need to understand that that's what it is and neither imagine that it's all bad nor cling to some techno-utopia that says it'll all work out in the end.
Right. So in other words, what you're saying, to quote my friend and distant cousin, another media critic, Todd Gitlin, there's nobody here but us humans to take care of this stuff. So with that, Yochai Benkler, thank you for joining us. You've been talking about your co-authored book, Network Propaganda, Manipulation, Disinformation, and Radicalization in American Politics, and we appreciate you being on the show.
Lovely to get a chance to talk to you.
And many thanks to Itai Shalem, our producer, and once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their partnership in this series. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably over 600 interviews by now. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Dalia on Twitter, that's also very important. And join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.